Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are strapping in for, a massive historical expedition. We're not looking at the biography of a general or a president, no. We are investigating the biography of a character who has, you could argue, shaped the Western world more than any other Yahweh. And here's the mission for our deep dive. We're going to trace this figure from his origins as a local desert Viking, a storm god in the southern wilderness, to his rivalry with Canaanite deities, then to the universal creator of everything, and finally, the plot twist. The moment a group of mystics decided he was actually the villain of the story.
It's an incredible journey.
It's a story of survival and just radical reinvention.
It really is. And I think we need to set the ground rules right away. We're talking about God with a capital G, but we are looking at this strictly through the lens of history. Anthropology.
Right, not theology.
Not theology in the sense of debating faith, no. We're looking at how a deity concept evolves with the people who worship him. Because, as their circumstances changed, from nomads to kingdom builders to exiles, their God had to change with them.
The God had to update his software, basically.
Exactly. If he didn't, he wouldn't have survived the Bronze Age.
Okay, so we're looking at the nuts and bolts, and before we really get into it, we have to talk about the name itself. Yahweh. It feels like we're seeing it more and more now, but for ages, nobody even knew how to say it. Why all the confusion?
It's a classic case of knowledge being lost in a catastrophe. The name is represented by those 4 Hebrew letters, YHWH, the tetragrammaton.
YHWH.
And in the ancient tradition, that name became so holy, you just didn't say it. You couldn't. So the reader would see YHWH in the text, but they would say Adonai out loud, which just means Lord.
And only a few people knew the real pronunciation.
Only the high priest in the Jerusalem temple. And when the Romans destroyed that temple in 70 CE, well, that tradition was broken. The chain of knowledge was amputated.
So when we say Yahweh, that's just a guess.
It's a very, very educated guess. A high-confidence reconstruction based on Hebrew grammar and how names were formed back then.
Yeah.
But I do want to clear up one thing the sources are very clear on. The name Jehovah is definitely wrong.
Wrong? How? It's everywhere. Indiana Jones, hymns?
It was a linguistic accident, a misunderstanding by German scholars way back in the Middle Ages. They were looking at the manuscripts and they saw the consonants YHWH. But the scribes, to remind the reader to say Adonai, had put the vowels from the word Adonai underneath the consonants.
Oh, like a little reminder note.
Exactly. It was a cheat code. But these German scholars didn't get that. They just mashed them together, the consonants of one word with the vowels of another. And in German, a Y sound is a J, so they got Jehovah.
That is wild. It's a historical typo that just stuck around for centuries.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Okay, that is fascinating. Before we jump back to the Bronze Age to see where this all started, I have one quick request. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
So, are we ready to head to the desert?
Let's do it. Section 1, the Desert Viking. This part of the research honestly floored me. You think of the God of Israel as, being from Israel.
Indigenous to the land, yeah.
Right, like he was always there. But the sources are pretty clear he was actually an import.
That's right. And this is where the archaeology is so interesting. The consensus now is that Yahweh was not originally a Canaanite god from the north. He came from the south.
From where exactly?
We're talking Midian, Edom, Mount Seir.
Yeah.
You're looking at a modern map. That's southern Jordan, northwestern Saudi Arabia.
Midian, that's from the Moses story, right? That's where he flees to.
Precisely. And that story preserves a memory of this. Moses meets God in the burning bush in Midian, not in Israel. But we also have external evidence. We have Egyptian records from the 14th century BCE that mention a group they call the Shasu of Yu.
The Shasu, who were they?
The Egyptians saw them as wanderers, like Bedouins, semi-nomadic, living on the fringes. Maybe they were herders, maybe raiders, tough people in a very tough environment.
So you've got these desert nomads worshiping a god named Yu. What was this god like? I'm guessing not the creator of the universe yet.
Oh, not even close. The personality of this early Yahweh is so different from the image of the old man on a throne. At this stage, he's a storm god.
But not a nice, gentle rain god.
No, he's the god of terrifying desert flash floods and violent thunderstorms, and he's a war god.
The source used this analogy I can't get out of my head. It said to think less King of England and more desert Viking.
It's a great image because it fits the oldest parts of the Bible perfectly. If you read the really ancient poetry, like the Song of the Sea or the Song of Deborah, Yahweh is marching out of the wilderness, from Edom, from Seir. The earth is shaking, mountains are melting. He's a god for a raiding party.
So he's violent, powerful, and very, very local. But he doesn't stay local. This brings us to section 2, the hostile takeover. Because these Yahweh worshippers eventually move north into what becomes Israel.
Right, and the north was not empty. This is during the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, and things are chaotic. These groups settle in the highlands, but the Canaanites are already there, and they have their own gods, a whole pantheon.
And this is where the biography becomes like a corporate merger or a takeover. Who were the main players?
Two big ones you need to know. First, there was El. El was the CEO, the father figure.
The old wise man with the beard.
Exactly. The wise patriarchal god on a throne. And then you had Baal. Baal was the young, virile superstar.
The warrior.
The warrior, and also a storm god. He was the one who brought the coastal rains that farmers needed for their crops. So Yahweh shows up in this neighborhood, and he basically has two options: assimilate or conquer.
And he does both, right?
Yeah.
How does he assimilate El?
It was basically a merger. Yahweh just absorbs El's imagery. He takes the name El, he takes the beard, the throne, the fatherly wisdom. That's why God is so often called El or Elohim in the Bible. It's like a fossil of that merger.
But with Baal, it wasn't a merger, it was a fight. The Bible really, really hates Baal.
Right, because with Baal, it was a turf war. They were redundant. You can't have two storm gods running the same territory. It just doesn't work.
The town ain't big enough for both of them.
Pretty much. So you see this intense rivalry in the texts. The biblical writers are working overtime to convince people, no, Baal doesn't bring the rain, Yahweh does.
But why was it such a hard sell?
Because if you're an Israelite farmer, you don't really care about theology. You care about rain. Baal had a great track record. Yahweh was this new guy from the desert. So people probably hedged their bets. That's why you get stories like Elijah having a magical duel with the prophets of Baal. It's basically propaganda to win hearts and minds.
And the imagery gets complicated too. The source mentioned bulls.
Yes, the bull was a symbol of strength everywhere. What's fascinating is that in the northern kingdom of Israel, they often worshipped Yahweh using a bull statue.
The golden calf.
That's the one. Most people think the golden calf was a different god. But the text says, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." They were worshiping Yahweh just using the local iconography.
And the writers from the south, from Judah, they hated that.
They thought it was barbaric. The story of Moses smashing the calf is probably political shade from the south making fun of the north, basically saying, look at those hicks up there with their bulls.
Ancient political attack ads. Amazing. Okay, section 3. High in the Holy of Holies. Let's talk about actual practice, because physical evidence is so rare.
Incredibly rare. But we have one site that is just a mind-blowing snapshot. A place called Tel Arad.
The shrine that was buried.
Yes. A legitimate Yahweh temple south of Jerusalem. At some point, it was decommissioned and carefully buried, which preserved the altars perfectly. And on those altars, scientists found the residue of what they were burning.
And what did they find? This is the wild part.
Okay, so on the big altar, they found frankincense. Pretty standard, smells good, it's a valuable offering. But on the smaller altar, right inside the Holy of Holies, they found cannabis resin.
You're kidding. They were smoking weed in the temple.
It sure looks like it.
Yeah.
And the analysis showed it was high in THC. They were burning it specifically for the psychoactive effect.
That completely changes the picture of ancient worship.
It does. It suggests that, like in many ancient religions, altered states of consciousness were part of the experience. We tend to sanitize religion today, quiet prayer. But ancient religion was visceral. It was loud, it was smelly, and it seems it involved intoxicants to induce visions or religious ecstasy.
It makes sense with the desert Viking thing. You're hyping yourself up for battle or to meet this terrifying god.
Exactly. It brings the human element right back into it.
Okay, so we have this intense local storm god cult that's absorbed the neighbors. But then catastrophe hits. This is the moment that forces a complete reboot of the whole system. Section 4, the exile and the invention of monotheism.
This is the absolute pivot point, 586 BCE. The Babylonians sack Jerusalem. They burn the city, and they destroy Yahweh's temple.
And we have to explain why that was such a theological crisis. A church burning down today is a tragedy, but it doesn't mean God is dead.
Right. But back then, gods lived in their houses, in their temples. If the Babylonians destroyed Yahweh's house, it meant one of two things.
Either Yahweh was dead,
or he was just weaker than Marduk, the god of Babylon. And if you're an Israelite being marched off to Babylon, you're not just losing your home, you're leaving your God's territory. You're effectively godless.
so the logical thing to do would be to just start worshiping the Babylonian gods who won.
That's what should have happened. The Yahweh cult should have died right there. But the Judean intellectuals, the priests in exile, they made a radical choice. To save their God, they had to reinvent him.
And this is where we get those later parts of Isaiah.
This is it. The spin was brilliant. They said, Yahweh isn't just the God of Israel. He's the God of the entire universe. He wasn't defeated by Babylon. No, he used Babylon to punish us for our sins.
That's an incredible upgrade. We didn't lose. Our God is just so powerful he controls our enemies.
It's a total reframe. And this is the birth of what we call radical monotheism. Not just our God is the best God, but there is no other God, period.
But there's a cost to that promotion.
A huge cost.
Yeah.
Because if Yahweh is the God of everything, he has to be responsible for everything.
The good and the bad.
Right. Who causes the exile? Who causes disasters? It'd have to be Yahweh. And there's this famous, chilling line from Isaiah where God says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil.
Wow. God creates evil. You don't see that on a coffee mug.
No, because it's so uncomfortable. It solves the power problem, but it creates a huge moral problem. And this is what later leads Christianity especially to really elevate the figure of the devil. They needed a cosmic scapegoat to take the blame for all the bad stuff.
So God could stay purely good.
Exactly. But in that moment of crisis, Yahweh took credit for all of it.
Okay, so he's now the universal cosmic creator. Fast forward a few centuries, and a carpenter from Nazareth enters the story. Section 5, Christianity and the little Yahweh. This connection blew my mind. How do you get from this invisible cosmic force to a human being who is also God?
This is where we have to understand the Jewish context of early Christianity. It wasn't a total break. It was tapping into a mystical tradition that was already there, sometimes called two powers in heaven.
Two powers? I thought they were hardcore monotheists by now.
They were, but they had a problem. If God is this infinite, unknowable, cosmic being, how does he interact with us? How does he show up in the world? So some Jewish thinkers developed this idea of a big Yahweh, the totally transcendent one, and a little Yahweh.
Little Yahweh, I've never heard that term.
It was a real concept, a visible intermediary. An angel, or a figure like the Son of Man in the book of Daniel, it was a being who could carry God's name and authority, but could actually be seen.
And that's the slot that Jesus fits into.
That's Paul's great innovation. Paul is a Jewish mystic. He has a vision of Jesus, and he plugs Jesus right into that little Yahweh role. Jesus becomes the visible image of the invisible God.
So for the first Christians, worshiping Jesus wasn't throwing away their Jewish faith?
Not at all. It was more like they were saying, aha, we found him. We found the little Yahweh we've been reading about. It was a framework that was already waiting.
But not everyone agreed. And this brings us to our final and maybe the most shocking section, the plot twist, Yahweh as the villain.
Enter the Gnostics.
The Gnostics. Their take on Yahweh is just something else. Why do they turn on him?
Well, they looked at the world, and they saw disease, cruelty, suffering, death. Then they looked at the God of the Old Testament, who gets angry and jealous and orders genocides. And they just said, this doesn't add up.
A perfect God couldn't have made this flawed world.
Exactly. The world is a dumpster fire, so the creator must be incompetent, or maybe even malicious. So they demoted Yahweh. They said the creator God of the Old Testament is actually a lower, ignorant, or evil being. They called him the demiurge, the craftsman.
So in the Gnostic version, Yahweh is the bad guy.
He's the jailer,
Yeah.
and in their story, Jesus is a rescue mission. But he doesn't come from Yahweh. He comes from a higher, alien God, a pure God who is way above the demiurge. Jesus comes to break us out of the prison of the material world that Yahweh created.
That turns the entire Bible on its head. The God of the Old Testament becomes the villain.
A complete inversion, and for a while, this was a major competitor to what we now call Orthodox Christianity. They had their own gospels, their own churches.
So why aren't they around today? Why is this just a footnote?
Because history is written by the winners. The Orthodox version, the one that said Yahweh is the Father of Jesus and the world is good, that's the one that eventually got the backing of the Roman Empire. The Gnostics were branded heretics, their books were burned. We basically forgot they existed until we dug up their library in Egypt in 1945.
The Nag Hammadi library. It just shows how fragile it all is. If a few things had gone differently, we might all be trying to escape the demiurge today.
Absolutely.
So let's wrap this up. What a biography. A desert Viking storm god moves north, absorbs his rivals, gets high in the temple, survives exile by rebranding as the god of the universe, splits in two to make room for Jesus, and then finally gets cast as the villain by a bunch of rebels.
It's a staggering evolution. And I think the final thought for you to take away is that we see theology as static, as some truth that was found and never changed. But history shows that gods are adaptations. Yahweh changed because his people needed him to. They needed to survive the desert, the exile, the Greek world.
It's survival of the fittest for deities. Evolve or go extinct.
In a way, yes. The Yahweh that survived is the one that could adapt to the changing landscape of the human mind.
And that leaves you with a final provocative question. If he evolved that much in the last 3,000 years, how is he evolving now? What will he look like in another 1,000?
That is the question.
Something to think about. Thank you so much for this. It's been a fascinating journey.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. If you want to dig into the source material, and I really recommend you do, check the info. Until next time, keep thinking deeper.